So welcome back. Yeah, my name's Prajnamanas and I'll give this talk, which is part of a drop-in series called Who is the Buddha? So we always have a talk and we're usually following a whole theme or series, but you can come to any night. It should work on its own or as a whole sequence. So, and hello online from me, and I'll assume you can hear me unless Harvey jumps up and down, waving his arms around. All right, you can hear me. Good. Yeah, so this series, Who is the Buddha? So we thought it was a pretty fundamental thing to look into. It's Buddhism, after all, that we're practicing. So we've had, I think this is the fourth session. We'll have 5. Next week's we'll kind of conclude and wrap it all up. Next week's talk is actually called Who is the Buddha? Which was hard for naming the YouTube thumbnail because the series is called that as well. So next week's called Who is the Buddha? Who is the Buddha? I don't have that problem. This evening is called The Death of the Buddha. And we're taking this loosely from Sangharakshita's book, Who is the Buddha? And that's I've already said it too many times, who is the Buddha, who is the Buddha? Anyway, I'm trying to stop saying it now. And my title is The Death of the Buddha. In this chapter of the book, and the title of the lecture it's taken from, death is in inverted commas. Okay, so it's the death of the Buddha. And I thought I'd start by asking what you make of that, because that will be very deliberate. He's highlighting or questioning death in the phrase, the death of the Buddha, in some way, but he's still using the word death. So, does anyone have any thoughts as to why that might be? I'll say more about the Buddha himself in a moment. But.
Well, it's probably like death, not the way we view it, but death of an enlightened being, which is something else entirely.
Yes, okay, something else entirely. Yeah, and not death as we view it. Okay, good. We'll come back to that. Yeah. Anything else? Any other ideas?
Is it because he's not in the cycle of birth and rebirth anymore, death and rebirth?
Yeah, okay, yeah. Not in the cycle of death and rebirth. Good. Thank you.
Could it be some semblance to death as like a passage to the next?
The next place or the next, whatever the next thing is. Yeah, death as a passage rather than the end. Yes, rather than the end. Yeah, good. There's one more somewhere over here.
Yeah, that was the same comment, sorry. So not a finite ending point.
Not a finite ending point, yeah. Great, okay. Yeah, thank you, that's a good spread, and I think you're all onto something, and I just like the way and wanted to highlight the fact that in the very title of the talk, he's saying there's something not ordinary about this death. So perhaps I'll say something about death generally and something about the Buddha. I say I'm going to breezily say things about those two things, but I'm sure I don't understand. They're probably the two most fundamental subjects there are. Anyway, the Buddha, just in case, a few people are here for the first time, I think, from earlier in the evening. So, as well as the sort of fountainhead of the whole tradition and the person who gave the teachings, which we're still practicing now, and is, if you like, the whole reason we're here now, the Buddha was a historical human being. So he lived in India, what's now northeastern India, 2,500 years ago. And I'm sure many of you know the story, but he was basically born an ordinary human being in very fortunate circumstances. So wealthy, fortunate, well protected, well looked after, and his father cultivated his life extremely carefully to try to protect him from questioning life, if you see what I mean, try to make sure he didn't become a wanderer. That probably only made things worse. He left the palace he was born in, wanted to seek the truth, and eventually did find it, at which point he becomes the Buddha. Before that, he's Siddhartha Gautama. So Buddha means one who is awake. So really he only becomes the Buddha at the point of what's known as the Enlightenment, which is a kind of irreversible breakthrough into complete wisdom as to the way things are, which can't now be undone. So no further doubt about the value of life is possible, no further hesitation in being kind or generous. And so from the Enlightenment onwards, and he still had about 50 years to live at that point, it's a life of service and altruism. And what that's expressed in is wandering on foot around India, basically communicating with people and giving enlightened communication. So very often, you'll have heard, if you've come to these evenings before, what happened when ordinary people made contact with the Buddha is usually, if not always, they were deeply struck by what he said. And at least the ones that are recorded in a lot of the stories, they wanted straight away to become his followers on one level. On another level, they attained some sort of transcendental insight as he spoke to them, after which their enlightenment was guaranteed. And in a handful of cases, their enlightenment spontaneously occurred as he spoke to them and gave them a teaching. So what he seems to have been particularly gifted at on the human level, as well as touching this completely transcendental type of consciousness and embodying it after the Enlightenment, he seems to have had a gift of really seeing somebody and telling them what they needed to hear. There's lots of stories of that, which I don't think there's time for, but he could take in a person quite fully, appraise their situation probably more deeply than they'd been able to, and say not just what they needed to hear, but what they didn't know they needed to hear, if you see what I mean. Go way, way further than they've been able to, and see them with complete wisdom. Not because he'd known them for any length of time, but because he had insight as to basically what caused suffering. And he could see a suffering person in front of him. And because he had no barriers anymore to divining what in each case that added up to, he could speak to people in such a way that if they were well prepared, and if they'd been practicing and warming their minds up to this point, could break through completely and become enlightened themselves. So that's part of what we've been looking at earlier in the series. So now we turn to this kind of problem of death, or this question of death at least, because in fact for the Buddha, I say problem, it wasn't a problem at all. For us, on the other hand, it must be the issue. I was going to say one of the main issues, but actually that makes it sound as though there's 6 or 7 of similar import to death. Actually, death must be the deepest issue that we've got to face. Actually, the Sangharakshita in this chapter remarks that the last days of the Buddha are recorded in more detail than any other event after the Buddha's enlightenment, if you see what I mean, which tells us something about its importance, not only in the Buddha's life, but in the lives of people who are practicing his path, if you see what I mean, because it's those people who wrote it down and who thought that future people would need it, if you see what I mean. So this text I've got here, the last days of the Buddha, that's one sutta or discourse. Many suttas are a page or even a kind of long paragraph. Some are 10, 15, 20 pages. This is 90 pages long, and it's just one text in the canon, if you see what I mean. So that starts to tell us something about the relationship of the unenlightened mind to death, which, leaving aside the tradition in the Buddhist life, I imagine we agree is the biggest issue we face. And I think that's because from very early on, we know that it's going to happen. I was remembering earlier that wise dictum about death and taxes, although I can't remember the detail now.
2 things certain in life, death and taxes.
Yeah, two things are certain in life, thank you. Death and taxes. So it's somewhere in the popular wisdom, isn't it? I know it's a bit grim. Well, you see, we can improve on it. But what I'm pointing to is that somewhere everybody knows that it must happen, and somewhere, at least for a time, everybody probably somewhere unconsciously believes that it won't quite happen to us. It doesn't seem relevant to us, possibly until much later, if we get the chance to contemplate it before it happens. And even then, I imagine that the approach of death itself, plus this deep wish to imagine that it can't happen to us, will be in much more vigorous conflict. And you do see that sometimes when somebody knows that they're in their last days or weeks. Yeah. So we'll look at that a bit more later on for our own lives. But I was just remembering earlier I was trying to think, when did I become aware, at least, of this as an issue? And I was remembering that my grandfather on my mother's side died when I was 7. And I definitely couldn't really take it in. I didn't know what it meant. I could see the adults around me. I don't know if this is usual for a 7-year-old or not, but there we are. I'm telling you. I could see the adults around me quite affected, quite distressed, also trying to kind of not give way to panic or be too obviously upset, trying to also make it all right, if you see what I mean, perhaps for each other, perhaps for me and my brother. And I was getting into bed that night. We lived in a different country, so I hadn't been nearby at the time. I was getting into bed that night, and I think my father told me to pray. And I think I might have refused or said no. And he said, well, at least put your hands together and say amen. Like this. So I said amen, like that. And I think he was trying to put across to me somehow, in a way that I could take in, something weighty has happened. And I think in whatever way he could do in the moment, I mean, he probably had a long day and it was yet another cycle of trying to get a child to go to bed, if you see what I mean. He was trying to communicate or trying to get something going between me and somebody else about acknowledging that something that we don't quite understand, but which also touches us, had gone on. And anyway, that's just my version, but I know that in every child's life it's got to arise at some point, and then there's got to be some communication around it. So from very early on we know it's going to happen. We don't know how it's going to happen or when, and it's unlikely we'll be able to choose. And I get the impression that as the years go by, that might dawn on us more. I was going to say it might haunt us more. Actually, the hope with Buddhist practice is that it haunts us less and less and becomes eventually not associated at all with fear. One of my teachers said on the first retreat I went on, just as we were settling down to do a ritual, he mumbled something about death and said, ultimately we're practicing for death. Dum 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 said a few other things, and we were wrapping our blankets around each other and starting the ritual, and I thought, what? What does that mean? Practicing for death. It sounded like practicing your batting or something, practicing for death. But it stayed with me, and I think in a positive way slightly haunted me that he'd said that. That was my first retreat, and I found it a joyous experience, my first retreat. I was quite frightened of my first retreat. I thought that, this is the way my mind was structured at the time, I thought that various demons were going to sort of come out at me and really kind of come up on my first retreat, and that I'd experience very, very strong emotions. It would probably be frightening and difficult and intense in all sorts of ways. Actually, it was just really lovely weekend. And I went for some walks and did some meditation, and I really enjoyed it and relaxed quite a lot, which I needed to do. But he did say we're practicing for death, and I kind of still remember that, because it's just a few words that says something about the path altogether. some traditions really, really emphasize death, some Buddhist traditions, I mean, and the moments and hours just before it, and even in the Tibetan tradition, the hours just after the death of the physical body, according to conventional medicine, during which the senses are only departing one by one, and the consciousness, which is now freeing itself of the body, might still be able to perceive things. So monks will whisper into the ear of a person who's just died, giving exhortations and instructions as to what to do as the consciousness becomes less associated with the physical world, and again is going to now encounter things that will probably frighten it, but needn't ultimately. And in fact, this stuff's become quite popularised now, and I think quite a lot more acceptable, things around near-death experiences, which one expert recently has called death experiences, because medically the person does actually die and then is revived, if you see what I mean, which we know biologically even is possible. Anyway, in near-death experiences, or whatever they're called, people often report still being able to perceive the people around them while the supposed death is going on. Have people come across stories like that? That it's as though quite often they're above the body, looking down, and can see things like doctors panicking. And they know intuitively that there's really nothing to panic about, if you see what I mean. And later, incredibly, people have come back into life and been able to tell these stories, which have amazing correspondences between them. It's really, really fascinating stuff to look into. There's a book called Return to Life by Jim Tucker, who was in that Netflix series. I can't remember what it was called. Surviving Death, it was called, actually. Series on Netflix, which I'd recommend. Anyway, his book Return to Life, just one recommendation, has got amazing stories in of, in his case, it's past life memories of young children. So, although we don't know what all of that involves, we intuit at some point in our life it's coming, and hopefully our Buddhist practice prepares us well for that, not with any morbid goal. Of course, with our lack of preparation for death, it sounds, like it did to me on my first retreat, a bit quirky and odd and morbid to talk about practicing for death. But slowly, I hope I'm starting to see what he means. This was Maitreya Bandhu, one of my friends and teachers leading that retreat. Another of our teachers, Jnanavacha, I've often heard him say that his mother, and this was also curious to me the first time I heard it, had a good death. I'd never heard somebody say something like that. This was also when I was first coming along, in my first months of coming along, that his mother had had a really good death and that he was really, really pleased for her and pleased about that. This was just a way of talking I hadn't come across. So strong is the conditioning that death is basically a bad thing, probably not to be looked at or talked about that much, kind of a bit kept out the way, although we also need to acknowledge its inevitability somehow. So we seem to have a kind of... Anyway, fear and confusion seem to be involved. Hopefully we purify our minds of that, and that's what Maitreya Bandhu meant when he said we're practicing for death. But yeah, some traditions place huge importance on the state of your mind just before you die, feeling that that's very significant for your consciousness, the state in which it enters, as you put it, the next thing or the next place, whatever that is, that must have value. There's even in the tradition a kind of karma called death proximate karma, which sits somewhere in the sort of hierarchy of different types, being quite an important type, i.e. that things that we thought or said or did just before our death are very fresh in the consciousness, in the Tibetan tradition, when we cross over that line. So it's a kind of subject of fascination for us, and I think that's a good thing, reflected in the fact that the Buddha's followers wrote down, I don't know if it's pretty much everything, but a huge amount of detail as to what was said and done in the last months of his life. So it's kind of an amazing story. It's called the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the great sutta on the decease, it's sometimes called. But maybe now to come to the death of the Buddha, its real name is the Parinirvana. Nirvana, as you probably know, means enlightenment. Pari means something like transcending or supreme. You hear it in the names of some order members, Pari or Parama. So Parinirvana, which is our word for the death of the Buddha, really only means supreme enlightenment. Quite curious, because he's already had the enlightenment. There seems to be one further stage of the enlightenment still to come, and that's his death. So his followers are really fascinated as to what that's going to mean. And as the sutta goes on, as the story goes on, there's a kind of atmosphere that builds. For example, the Buddha at one point relinquishes the will to live. So there's a little chapter called the Relinquishing of the Will to Live. And that's him doing something which, again, has actually now been backed up by contemporary science, which is that there does seem to be a link between letting go of life and dying itself, if you see what I mean. So it doesn't just seem to be a medical matter, whether or not you stay alive. You see this quite a lot in stories of cancer patients, that there are often things that people wait for in order to do, a last person that they want to see. And then the death follows. I even heard recently, I think it was somebody speaking here, that quite often a person will die shortly after loved ones have left the room, because they then seem to feel more ready. Partly because living people already can't quite grasp where the dying person is and is going. And in order to fully let go, it seems to be easier not to be in the company of living people. Anyway, the Parinirvana, supreme enlightenment, was a subject of fascination for the followers. And they had 4 questions for him. So they kept asking him, because they really want to know. Does the Buddha exist after death? Or not exist after death? Or does he both exist and not exist? Or neither exist nor not exist? If you see what I mean. Indian logic adds the both and neither. If you have a dichotomy, A or B, it adds both A and B, neither A nor B, just to make sure you've really covered all the bases. And the Buddha says that all of them are inappropriate to say of a Buddha. Let's see what he says exactly. He says, it is inappropriate to say of a Buddha that after death he exists. It is inappropriate to say of a Buddha that after death he does not exist. And I won't go through the both or neither, but he spells that out. He finishes saying, all ways of telling, all ways of describing are totally inapplicable to the Buddha. Okay? So he refused to answer, basically. I imagine, knowing that they wouldn't grasp it. In another sutta, questions like that, of which one of these is one, are called the imponderables, or else unanswerables. Avya Kreta Vastuni, they're called. I don't know why I wanted to remember that, but I did. It means something like imponderable or unanswerable. And the Buddha gives similar answers. He seems to say they're all views. What he means by that is, if you say that something exists, you're attached to an idea. If you say that it doesn't exist, ditto. Same for both, same for neither. Which again, I hope, at best, can really sort of baffle our categories. And actually is him coming back, not just refusing to give a teaching, but giving a teaching, which is that in the Buddhist tradition, or in his teaching, any way of grasping onto an understanding is a view, and therefore is a sort of extreme. So the later tradition, the Mahayana, called existence and non-existence extremes, as in intellectual opinion forming at the extreme, which I find really intriguing, because we tend to want to say, don't we, like the monks, look, does it exist or does it not exist? I don't know, London or something. Does it, it either exists or it doesn't exist, surely. End of story. Do you see what I mean? The mind wants to do this. The teaching of the Buddha is actually you can take up any object and these categories won't apply. The real application of that here, and the reason they're particularly fascinated by the death, is that this is all rooted in a tradition, and somebody, Anne I think, suggested this at the beginning, is all rooted in a tradition that assumes rebirth. So that's a really important part of the historical spiritual context that we can forget. But I think if you look more deeply into Buddhism, you can't really continue to do it without bearing in mind the context of rebirth, which doesn't mean that you've got to swallow something about rebirth yourself, if you see what I mean, or take on a view or an idea that you're not ready to, or a belief. It really just means you can't strip the Buddhist tradition of something that's inconvenient to our modern mind, which is that consciousness in some way continues after the death of the physical body. And now they were completely used to that, assumed it, and one of the reasons they were practicing was not just practicing for death, but practicing for rebirth. Well, there's two levels to this actually. Monks who'd made a lot of progress and had good conditions would be practicing for enlightenment, which means no further rebirth. And in the tradition, that's a good thing, because rebirth is associated with suffering and being stuck in a cycle where, because we keep wanting things and keep feeling that something in the material world we can get, which will resolve some sort of pain we have, is still possible, and because the consciousness is clinging on in that way, or the stream of consciousness, because of course it's not a fixed thing, it will express itself in a new body, and in a way have to do this whole life all over again, with all of its emotional learning, ups and downs, pain and illness. You've got to go through a whole biological life again after all. So in the tradition that's undesirable. So monks who were ambitious and who'd made progress, or anyone who was spiritually ambitious, let's say, would be practicing to end the cycle of death and rebirth. But the Buddha always, a bit like I was saying earlier, he knew who his audiences were and how to communicate with them, and plenty of his followers, the instructions he was giving them were for a good future rebirth. So saying, if you want a fortunate time next time round, do these things. Like practice the ethical precepts. Don't kill, lie, steal, etc. Avoid those things, cultivate their opposites, and your next time round will be more fortunate. So, in their minds, these people who are putting these imponderable questions to him, it's got really, really intriguing by now, if you see what I mean, because people who've been progressing along the spiritual path, people, which is actually something like dependent streams of consciousness as they morph and develop, never staying the same, have taken new bodies, which also, of course, never stay the same, so there's nothing fixed about it, and made progress, up to the point where somebody's actually become enlightened. What happens to them after they die? Do you see what I mean? So I, as a follower of the Buddha, I'd be hoping to practice his way so that the next time round it kind of went better, and I didn't have some of the, bad mental habits that create my suffering now, and that I get rid of at least some of them with the work I'm doing in this life. They're saying, but if you're a Buddha, what then? And he refuses to answer. So one of the things Sangharakshita points out in the lecture is that for the Buddha, death is no problem at all. And in fact, not even really a change. So the physical body will expire, of course, and the Buddha was very in touch with that. He said in his final sickness, he described himself as a worn-out carriage held together with straps. Quite a sort of painful image, isn't it, of a really rickety, really tired, painful body. He's perfectly aware of that. And yet completely unworried by death, such that, it's a rather lovely story, and I'll just tell the story now of the final days. His mind was not just unperturbed, but seemed to be becoming more and more peaceful. And not just that, not just a kind of peace of mind thing, more and more loving. So some of the things you notice in the kind of farewell tour that he makes, once he's relinquished the will to live, and he says to his attendants, 3 months from now, the Buddha will have his final passing away. He continues to teach and practice altruism in that way and just go to the next place where he's aware somebody else, or where he's heard that somebody else could do with hearing his teaching, which involves still walking places, even though he's very tired and old, in his 80s. Continues to appreciate beauty, so sometimes they're walking along and he just rejoices in the beauty of a place. Continues to give discourses and teachings, and actually to take new disciples, which I also find a bit fascinating, because he's not going to be around to teach them. But he and they seem to find it meaningful that he will admit somebody into the order, or give somebody the precepts, or accept somebody as a follower, and give them that, not just communication, but initiation before his time runs out. And gives his final instructions to the Sangha. So that's the monks who've gathered around him and decided to go for refuge, as it's known, and tells them, for example, meet frequently and in harmony, and your spiritual community will prosper for a long time. Fail to do that, and it won't. It's quite sobering. He always gives the positive and the negative to make it really, really clear. Clarity is another thing you notice. He's very, very clear. The most succinct expression of his teaching is the path of ethics, meditation, and wisdom, which I won't kind of sum up now. But on this farewell tour, he keeps reiterating ethics, meditation, and wisdom. That those are all three things you can cultivate, but also they're a progression. In short, becoming more and more ethical settles the mind so that it can meditate more deeply, and then it can penetrate into wisdom. Once we've grasped how things really are, suffering can be transcended. And I imagine he might have been doing that because it's really memorable and brief. Do you see what I mean? And he knew that his time was short, so he keeps reiterating ethics, meditation, and wisdom for one thing. And then he settles in a place called Kusinagara and declares that this is the place where the Buddha will have his final passing away. And he's near a great city, but he doesn't want to go there. He picks this little tumble-down village, and it's quite sweet. His attendant, Ananda, who's been walking with him and serving him for many, many years, calls it, in one translation, this miserable little town of wattle and daub in the back of beyond, and says, please don't die here. I get that you've relinquished the will to live, I get that this is a big deal, I get that it's up to you in the end, but kind of, not here, but the Buddha says, this is where it's going to happen. He doesn't say why, I don't know why myself, but he lies on his side on a low stone bench built for a village elder to sit on, between very tall trees called sal trees. And he basically gives people a last opportunity to ask him questions. And it's a huge assembly. So all kinds of human beings, princes, ascetics, fire worshippers, I don't know exactly what they are, but they worshipped fire, merchants, peasants, monks, lay followers have all gathered around. And in the story, it's rather lovely, it's got a sort of touch of the of the loveliness and innocence of a children's story, even the animals gather around. Elephants, snakes, deer, birds. And the whole assembly is extremely moved and weeping, except for two categories, the Enlightened Disciples and the cat. For some reason, but apparently there's particularly popular scene to depict in Chinese and Japanese painting of the later tradition. It seems to be made a point of that the cat is not crying. Everybody's crying, except the cat. The cat does not cry. It's apparently odd. I don't know what they had against cats, but they are kind of independent, aren't they? They kind of got this thing about doing their own thing, and you can't take that away from them. The more you try, the worse it gets, I've found. So the whole assembly is very, very moved. And he understands this, and he understands that people may want to ask him something. He understands that they're upset at what they're about to lose, even though he's got insight into the fact that there isn't ultimately something to be upset about. So quite an interesting thing's going on. You can see, we often say that the Buddha has broken through into wisdom and compassion. I think you can see this here. He knows that his death is not a threat to anybody. Not even in some mysterious way a change. And so that's the wisdom. He's completely empathetic, completely understands their response to him, which is, in some cases, not just grief, but a kind of panic. We're about to lose the Buddha. You can imagine it, can't you? I mean, if you lived around a Buddha, blimey, you'd be quite glad to, hopefully. And you think, we need what we can get here. So he is giving them some last chances. He says, "Do you have anything further to ask me?" And the assembly's silent. And so he asks a second time. And then he twigs something, because the third time he asks everyone, didn't ask me. He says, "If you don't want to speak aloud in front of the assembly, whisper your question to a friend, and that friend can come and whisper it in my ear, and I can answer it." Isn't that lovely? So moving. He understands that, I don't know, it's a bit like asking a question in a class, sort of like, how did you get on with your meditation or something? He kind of gets that, completely tuned into it, and creates a way for them to do it. Actually, it looks as though his last months of communication have been so complete that everybody who was there actually didn't have anything further to ask, or at least was so awestruck with the occasion and so absorbed in contemplation of the Buddha and of the atmosphere that any supposed questions had melted away, which is one of the best things that can happen to a question, by the way, I would say. Is it something like all this anxious stuff about, do you exist after death? You're going to not exist? What are you going to do? Is it both? Neither? Tell us. Is kind of can't settle down completely. And if wise people in this life are anything to compare with, I imagine that being around him was something like that. People often say that our teacher and founder, Sangharakshita, you'd go to him with a really thorny issue or a problem, or something about yourself that you needed to sort of ask, or something about your future that had been preoccupying you in your spiritual life, and you'd go to him, and once you're in the room, you'd completely forget what it was and come out uplifted, and like you might be able to remember your question, but it was not burning anymore in the same way, because what's happened, of course, is that your perspective has widened, so the context of the question has changed because your mind has changed. So people really, really often found that, got a bit kind of pleasantly dumbfounded, if you see what I mean, by the presence of a mind that is simply bigger than theirs. So that seems to be happening. But Ananda, the Buddha's attendant, is sort of off stage somewhere and has missed some of this. And he's leaning against a doorpost by a vihara, a kind of a hut, I imagine, weeping. So I'll just tell you what he says, because this is particularly sort of attentive and moving act of the Buddha's in his last hours. So he's, for some reason they always specify leaning against a doorpost, which you can see someone doing, can't you? Like this, in a real kind of in desolation, saying, I am still but a learner, and still have to strive for my own perfection. But alas, my master, who is so compassionate towards me, is about to pass away. So he's saying, he's thinking of himself as well. You can sort of tell at this point that he's not yet enlightened. He does become enlightened shortly after the Buddha's death in the story. He's saying, I've still got lots to learn. But he also says, my master, and that's got a capital M, who was so compassionate towards me, is about to pass away, and he's weeping. And the Buddha finds out, again, I mean, he can't move now because he's so close to death, but via, second and third degree reports of monks kind of shuttling back and forth, that this is what Ananda is doing. Someone comes all the way back and says verbatim what Ananda just said, and the Buddha says, well, go and get him for me. So the shuttles go back, get Ananda. Ananda returns, and there's loads encapsulated in what the Buddha says back. So I'll read this as well. And this is a cousin of the Buddha's, Ananda, who's been his attendant for a long time, I think something like 20 or 30 years, who just wanted to be close to him, wanted to absorb the teachings, actually made a deal with the Buddha when he said, okay, I'll be your attendant, as long as if I miss a teaching, because I'm off begging food for you, or attending to another of your needs, that you repeat it exactly as you gave it when I come back. So, rather beautiful, I think, really, really wants to serve, but definitely wants to learn, which might be part of why he's saying I'm still a learner, and that's what's painful, that the master's about to pass away. And a friend and a servant, and a very, very faithful companion to the Buddha. So he's said this thing about his master passing away, and he's been weeping. The Buddha picks up on all this and says, enough, Ananda, do not grieve, do not lament. For have I not taught from the very beginning that with all that is dear and beloved, there must be change, separation, and severance? Of that which is born, come into being, compounded and subject to decay, how can one say, may it not come to dissolution? There can be no such state of things. So he's saying, I've taught you that. It's got to apply to me as well. If you really take that in, you won't feel pain at this. And he continues, now for a long time, Ananda, you have served the Buddha with loving kindness in deed, word and thought, graciously, pleasantly, with a whole heart and beyond measure. Great good have you gathered, Ananda. Now you should put forth energy, and soon you too will be free from the taints, which means enlightened. And I just find that very, very lovely. So he's saying to him, come on, I've told you about this. I think he's saying it's okay. He's not just saying it's okay. He's saying you could know deep down that this isn't actually a threat, if you see what I mean. And I have told you. So he's appealing to the fact, you do know this, I've told you, and you've to some extent probably taken it on board. But see if you can try again, yet again, to take this on board. And then, again, very attuned to somebody's emotions, to where they're at as an ordinary human being, he rejoices in him. Which is very often what an upset person needs. If someone's feeling discouraged or worried about their own spiritual progress or anything else, sometimes you feel like the impulse is to comfort, if you see what I mean. I'd suggest that a sort of improvement on that is even to encourage somebody in another way. And he's saying, you've really been practicing, you've really served me. And he says, graciously and beyond measure, in deed and word and thought. So he knows that Ananda has cultivated loving thoughts for the Buddha even, rejoices in him. So there's kindness and there's instruction right to the very end. And this opportunity to clear up doubts, which he keeps offering to the Sangha. And then when that seems to be it, he gives a last pronouncement, which has had lots of different translations. As is something like, the Buddha, these are his final words, decay is inherent in all conditioned things. With diligence, strive on. Sometimes you hear that with mindfulness, strive on. I saw it in another translation this weekend, strive with earnestness. So he's saying, really, all things that are conditioned, so that's all things that are not enlightened consciousness, which is unconditioned, are subject to decay. That's often what the tradition calls it. Decay sounds a bit disgusting to us, but just the tradition just means breaking down, breaking apart, ending, losing its present nature. So he's saying everything that's conditioned is subject to that. With mindfulness, strive on. And then he ascends through some very refined superconscious states. For some reason, again, there's commentaries on this, comes back down to the first refined state beyond the ordinary mind and dies. Yeah. So I haven't said there what happens after death and what doesn't. I've said that the tradition's got this rebirth perspective, that enlightenment is said to transcend, but also that the Buddha is not saying what happens or doesn't happen to consciousness that is enlightened once the physical body is parted with. But I think at least what this can conjure for us is something like what we could call the deathbed perspective. So I think what the Buddha is really exemplifying here is what I mentioned Jnanavarcha calling a good death. I mean, that's probably the best death that we've known in our kind of universe, really. Not just these humans, but these animals, and of course lots of non-material beings, lots of gods and spirits that have gathered round, is partly saying to the reader of this story that this is an event of universal significance that's happening now. But I find it very, a teaching in itself that the universe at that moment, down to the very last bird, goes quiet in reverence. And one of the Buddha's later instructions, shortly before this, is that the monks afterwards should get on with their practice, that the lay followers should deal with his remains as they would those of a great king. We haven't got too much time to go into that, but he's saying there, reverence is a positive thing. So he's saying it will do the sangha of lay followers good. It will be a positive practice for them to treat my remains like they would a great king. But that's not him saying, I am the best. Because of course, after all, he's chosen this wattle and daub dive in the back of beyond to die in, if you see what I mean. You got that and him knowing that really this is an event of huge significance, not associated with him personally particularly, and that this is a good way for people to proceed. So he's given people that and lots of other practices to proceed afterwards. So hopefully what that can give to us is something about the preciousness of the opportunity of being alive, if you wanted to put it another way, practicing for death. But I hope with our practice reaching a point where as we get to the very end, there's very little further to do, perhaps nothing further to do. Not just no regrets, but last communications completed. Of course, we've got no idea if we'll have that opportunity even. We don't know. Kuslasara mentioned death in the meditation in the first half, and I was remembering that I used to have a practice of when I meditated here for an hour in the morning with the community, imagining that the bell that went after an hour, which is enough time to get quite lost in your meditation or get quite absorbed, echoed the arrival of death, as in that the bell would ring just as death will come, and that the mental state I'm in, that might be how it happens, if you see what I mean, because it could catch us at any time. What is the mind that we're cultivating, even in this meditation, given that it could come at any time? As I say, and as I think the story of the Parinirvana really helps with, not in some morbid or fearful way. So I think there's loads of reassurances in that story that it's not something to be frightened of, that it is something to be practiced towards, and that is something to do now. Hence the Buddha instructs Ananda again, saying, I've told you this before, please try and remember it. Or the reason that he finishes by saying, with mindfulness, strive on. Not when you know you're in your last weeks. Do it now. Try to arrive at a point where you're not frightened. Try to have a good rebirth. Or if you like, if you at least agree that consciousness will continue in some sort of way, which lots of people's accounts of being at or near death seem to corroborate, try to make that a positive, loving, generous, aware consciousness. That will become particularly important at the end, but that we can definitely practice for that now, and in every moment. And that's what I was getting at with my little meditation exercise some years ago, is saying, in what mind will it catch me in? Therefore, what mind do I want to have, moment to moment? Every time I sit to meditate, every time I walk down the street, what do I want to have cultivated that will be present at the end of this body, at the end of this identification of Prajnamanas and this body and all of my thoughts and feelings? What is it that will be dispersing? And I think that's why we practice, and that's something we can do now. If in doubt about how to do that or what to do, I think there's something in that instruction of the Buddha to his lay followers to treat his remains like those of a great king. What he means by that is revere the enlightened mind. So if we're in any doubt what to do next, or if we find it difficult or think that all of this striving is complicated and it goes on a long time and I don't always know what to do next, if in any doubt, he's saying, have faith in enlightened consciousness and revere that. So I guess that's my kind of suggestion to you, if you see what I mean, is to keep practicing in all the ways we do, knowing that the mind, moment to moment, is accruing some sort of momentum, which we will come into more contact with when that conflict between life and death is rising to more of a pitch, or if not, at least whether imaginatively or physically, like with an image, gaze at the Buddha and know that all of those problems actually can be gone beyond. Okay. Sorry that there isn't time for questions this evening, but what we'll do instead is chant a mantra. So, as a little aid to revering the Buddha, I'll lead us in a bit of chanting, and we'll just chant his name. And you could look at the Buddha, or you could close your eyes. And this is just an easy way to make a bit of contact with that consciousness that knows that in the end this is not really a threat, but that's a place that we've got to get to via our own striving. Okay, so just settle as you would for meditation. And then when I've chanted the mantra once or twice, you can join in. We'll let that fade, and then I'll ring a bell for the end of the class. Shakyamuni Swami Shakyamuni Swaha. Om Muni Muni Mahamuni 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 Shakyamuni Okay, that's all there's time for. But I hope to see you for the conclusion of the series next week. And just as a reminder, we really rely on donations, although of course you don't have to give. We really, really appreciate anything you can give to help us keep doing what we do here at the centre, putting on classes and retreats and so on. So there'll be a bowl, maybe even a team member holding a bowl as you go out. But thanks very much for coming, and if you don't mind putting the mats and cushions back. And why don't we keep this room in silence? So let's pack away in silence and just talk when we go out. Okay, good night to you online.